You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin and Tony is with me and we're here to discuss all of entertainment bits and business and tech news from the world of streaming from the past week. So we're going to jump straight into the news and start off with Netflix as usual. Sundance Award winner Giving Voice is going to be headed to Netflix. Netflix acquired this for a significant amount of money. There is a film called The Trial of Chicago 7, which is the next Aaron Sorkin film. And this is actually supposed to be getting a theatrical release, but instead there is word that it might be moving to streaming and Netflix could in fact be buying the film. This has an all-star cast and could be probably one of the bigger films that ends up making it to streaming. And then finally for Netflix, there's a Juneteenth musical that is currently in development at Netflix with Kenya Barris, the creator of Blackish, among other shows, and Pharrell Williams, who will be working on this project.
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. One is because I don't think a lot of people know about Juneteenth. It's been in the news a little bit more recently due to a bunch of other factors, but up until then, it was pretty not well-known holiday for a large portion of people, especially where I live. And I think it's good to, tell that story and tell the story about Juneteenth and why it's important. Even more so, it's interesting about this idea of musicals because you don't really see many musicals coming out mainly just due to they're expensive, they're hard to coordinate, and sometimes audiences don't appreciate them. So I'm curious what a musical on Netflix, how that's going to look like. How is it going to be different from maybe like Les Mis or something else that we've seen on the big screen before, and what does being on Netflix on a streaming service, what opportunities does that provide the creators of the musical to make it special and stand apart? So I'm kind of curious to see how that's going to go down, and I hope it's going to go well. I mean, the story of Juneteenth needs to be told, so I'm happy about that.
The one thing that I would probably compare it to is outside of the big budget theatrical release musicals that obviously are done with a lot of money, you have the other end of the spectrum, which is recently there has been a lot of broadcast channels that have been doing musicals. There was Grease, there was, I believe, a Peter Pan. There was a lot of different musicals that were put on live on channels like Fox, NBC, ABC, things like that. And I think that is not something that people, I think The Little Mermaid was one of the most recent ones. That was earlier this year on ABC. But I think that it makes sense, and Netflix can put more money into it than a broadcast channel, and it's not going to be live, so that they're not hindered by what is actually happening. I think the idea of a live musical it has its perks. Obviously, if you're going to see a musical in person, seeing it live is great, but I think something that's produced really well actually turns out a little bit better. Perfect example is we've got Hamilton coming up on Disney Plus in a little over a week, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But it's interesting because that is basically they recorded the musical as it was being produced as it was being done on stage where it was typically being done. So I think there is a market for musicals. It'll just be interesting to see how it ends up working out.
Well, if we think about musicals just as another form of entertainment that streaming services are trying to co-opt, I mean, we've seen streaming services try to adapt podcasts.
It's true.
Obviously, books, comics. I mean, yes, those are things that they're going to have to develop in-house and actors and stuff and write scripts. But for Broadway plays, I mean, that like you can film that content, or you can film that content like live in terms of maybe the shows that you're talking about that air just in general. But or you can talk about like this Juneteenth thing that's going to be on Netflix where they have some time to work with it. It's not live. They can do different shoots and stuff like that. But either way, it's like another medium to get stories. And as long as there's a new influx of stories, then it's going to be fine.
Yep.
And I think that, I haven't really thought about it until today is that, Broadway is an untapped avenue. But yeah, that's actually kind of an interesting idea is that there is a huge audience for Broadway. Those are stories that have been developed, that have been battle tested over the years, that are popular. I think it's good for the Broadway industry. I mean, I think it's great for consumers in general. So that's a new avenue to think about.
Yeah, as long as it doesn't end up like Cats, I think we'll all be fine.
Oh, wow. That's like... Man.
All right, so Prime Video. Jim Gaffigan has set his second comedy special on Prime Video, and Amazon has acquired the rights to a documentary based on voting rights. This is an untitled project, but will be coming to Amazon as well. Jumping over to Hulu, there's a limited series called Dope Sick featuring Michael Keaton, which will focus on the opioid addiction. That is going to be on Hulu in the future. And then the bigger news for Hulu is that Hulu has announced that they're partnering with IMAX to stream a lot of their documentaries, 16 documentaries, in fact. Now, the really interesting thing about this announcement is it brought to light Hulu's lack of 4K content.
Yeah, I mean, at first I was like, hey, this is really cool. Obviously IMAX has great quality content because it's IMAX and kind of you also pay a whole lot of money to go to the theater, so you expect a good story. And so I was like, okay, that's a cool way to share the medium, to share the story, especially as people are home during COVID-19. I mean, that's another way to do it, to spread the word. But reading throughout the article, I realized that Hulu doesn't have a big presence in 4K, and that's a little bit surprising because, the new trend in just TV in general is to move to 4K, and that 4K televisions have gone down in price dramatically. I mean, HDR has been a new thing as well, and there's a lot more streaming players and Blu-ray players that will support 4K and 4K HDR, which is a complicated way just to say it's going to look pretty good. And so I'm surprised that Hulu is actually kind of behind the bar, and that they had an implementation of it in 2016, but they shelved that, then reintroduced it again in 2019, and then there hasn't really been anything kind of coming from that except maybe some of their original shows. So that's a little bit, that's kind of a big issue, I think, in my opinion, is that you're trying to sell your service against maybe Netflix or, Disney Plus or something else, is that you've been in the game for a long time and yet you don't have 4K support. I have a little bit of grace for HBO Max because they just launched, but they need to get 4K content soon. And for Hulu, who's been in the game for such a long time, I'm very surprised and disappointed that they don't have 4K content. I would have thought that they would have been in one of the leaders who had 4K stuff. So this is definitely surprising.
Yeah, and I think that there's certain some of the IMAX documentaries could really benefit from having that 4K ability, and they're just not going to be able to have it, which is unfortunate. I think ultimately 4K is the way of the future, and you even look at some things now, they've got 8K TVs and things like that. And while everything streaming-wise requires way more bandwidth in order to make stuff like that happen, it does make sense for that to be something that could be down the pipeline. We know that HBO Max launched without 4K capabilities, and that they've said that that's stuff that they plan on rolling out in the future, but it's not something that it was a huge priority for them in the beginning. Hulu, however, has been around for a long time, so it's not like they really have a reasonable excuse as to why they didn't do it, unless there just wasn't enough content available to them that was in 4K to make it worthwhile to have that benefit. Because that's the only thing I can think of.
Honestly, I thought that a great way to announce that you're really putting 4K on the map is to launch it with these IMAX titles. I mean, The thing with the 4K is that, it does look great, but, TVs are getting bigger and they're also getting cheaper. So, if the bigger the screen, the more gaps you could potentially see, the more granular. If the quality is really bad, you can really see a lot of the issues. And, with these IMAX beautiful shots that are, usually displayed on an IMAX screen, which is huge. Like on a tiny screen, you won't see some of those issues if it's in a lower resolution. But a lot of people that I know have 50-inch, 60-inch, 70-inch TVs, and you can see if its quality is just even 1080, you can see it just doesn't look as good, especially just something that's just as big and beautiful as IMAX. So I feel like this is kind of a lost opportunity and a great way to just get a little bit free press of hey, you get IMAX and beautiful 4K. Hey, we do 4K now. We've always done 4K, but we're legit doing it this time. So it's just, I think it's a little bit of a wasted opportunity, but I think looking at this IMAX acquisition, as you want to call it, in a little bit different way, I think Disney has a really good grasp of, especially as somebody who's just starting in the space for a year now, they have a good grasp of what people like to watch. And, we see Netflix just go big with documentaries, and Disney Plus has some documentaries, National Geographic, they own that. And so they have a whole channel of documentaries. And so IMAX documentaries are kind of like a good parody on Hulu to kind of mirror that. And so that they have even more documentaries on their platform. And I think that Disney overall kind of understands, okay, we need to diversify our content library into kind of different categories. And documentaries is definitely one that people do like, and I think that's great.
All right, so next up, CBS All Access. Speaking about their current assets that Viacom CBS has, CEO Bob Bakish has stated that they're seeking more control of its streaming destiny, and they are planning to not sell off a lot of their content going forward because they want to have it on their own service. This is obviously in line with what we've expected. Now, this is specifically stating because, for example, South Park is in fact a show that's on Comedy Central, which is part of Viacom CBS. There's also Yellowstone, which is a show on the Paramount Network, which is also part of Viacom CBS. Both of those shows are going to HBO Max and Peacock, respectively. And he's basically stating that there's a lot of things that they are not looking to license out at this point because they do want a lot of their shows to exist on their specific service. He specifically named areas like sci-fi, kids, or procedurals, and I would specifically state that a lot of the really popular shows on CBS, specifically NCIS, CSI, Criminal Minds, those kind of shows. I don't know, CSI is not currently airing, but a lot of those police shows, SEAL Team, SWAT, Hawaii Five-0, which I think is ending this year anyway, Blue Bloods, a lot of those shows that do really, really well for the network, they're not looking at putting those anywhere else, even though they could make a bunch of extra money for them through licensing rights. I think that everybody's realized who has a media company at this point that the intent was, it's always great to make extra money and not have to put a lot of effort into it, but everybody's, I think, realized, except for Sony at this point, that it really comes down to who if you can make more money, if you can have a successful subscription service. CBS All Access has a significant number of subscribers. If they convert that over into something slightly different with more content available for people, but at the same price points or a little bit higher price points or whatever, it will give them a lot more opportunity to bring in more revenue. And I think that's obviously very important for a media company compared to bringing in a steady flow of revenue from licensing, but not having a whole lot of room to grow without going and creating more content that has to end up being successful that you can then go and license to somebody else. So it makes perfect sense. The one thing I do want to particularly bring up is he mentions kids, and probably the biggest Viacom CBS property that they have that is kids related is Nickelodeon, which already has a couple of smaller versions of they have Nicktoons, which is a small service. Verve has an option where you can add a Nickelodeon channel to it. Prime Channels has a Nickelodeon channel that you can add to it that allows you to get some of the older Nickelodeon content. But there was also, more importantly, a deal that was put in place either late last year or early this year. I can't recall off the top of my head. But there was a deal that was put in place where Viacom CBS, this was actually Viacom who did this because it was before the merger actually took place earlier this year. Viacom announced that they were going into a deal with Netflix where Netflix was going to be creating original content based off of IP that was currently on Nickelodeon and expanding it, doing like original movies that tie into the shows that are on Nickelodeon, things like that. That was announced, and I'm not even joking, like weeks before the Viacom CBS like re-merger that occurred. And it was interesting because when the merger took place, they immediately started talking about this new streaming service that they were going to try to put together. And it was odd because Nickelodeon is a big factor when it comes to the amount of programming that they have that's being created for children in general. So that begs a question of, well, eventually that could turn into one of these deals where like Disney had certain things that were on Netflix and then they, after a certain amount of time, they'll end up back on Disney Plus. That's probably going to end up being a similar situation, but it does beg the question of Netflix is out there. They've been licensing content from a lot of these big media companies for a really long time, and a lot of these big media companies they've been getting content from are now creating their own services to directly compete with Netflix. Netflix really has to go that route of stepping up and creating content themselves that can be really successful. They have to have more series like Stranger Things or Ozark or, House of Cards back when it was really big, shows that Orange is the New Black, shows that were really successful for them, but specifically like Stranger Things that go outside the realm of just being successful and having people watch it, but also being able to have merchandise and things that they can make more money off of these series. Because if they don't have originals that can do that, and they just keep creating original after original after original, they run into a position where they don't have the content that everybody else has that people are looking for. So it also explains why for the last year and a half we've been talking since we started the podcast how Netflix is spending an enormous amount of money trying to create content, because they're basically trying to catch that lightning in a bottle over again with Stranger Things and some of these other projects that have been real high profile for them, in order to make sure that as these other streaming services pop up from competing media companies, they have content that's still going to draw people in and still keep people around, instead of them dropping Netflix and moving over to one of the newer services.
I understand this position better after we talked a little bit before the air, because I was like, I understand CBS, Viacom CBS, I understand the strategy of it and the logic of it, but when they said key assets, I'm like, okay, what are some of their key assets? It's like, okay, Star Trek. What else do they have? And so when I think about a lot of the demographics that they reach with their CBS just TV channel and trying to translate that over to maybe trying to move those customers over to the streaming service to like cut the cable, whatnot. It's definitely like NCIS, Criminal Minds, Hawaii Five-0. I mean, there's a lot of content there that I know people that demographic watch, and it's a lot of fun for them, and I get it, and it's I can definitely see those procedural type cop shows, those drama shows, really having a foothold on a streaming service, and so it definitely does make sense why Viacom CBS wants to hold on to those assets. And you look at HBO Max as kind of like a counterexample to this idea of, okay, well, let's keep everything in-house for exclusivity. HBO Max has some interesting deals with other players in the space, and that, okay, like some of their content can be on a different service and they'll rotate out content, and it's a little bit different, and it's kind of a little bit bucking the norm a bit, because you see Disney Plus really claw back a lot of their titles from mainly Netflix, but then some other places to try to get it back. Okay, everything's under the Disney Plus banner, and you see HBO Max is kind of like, okay, like we have our service, we have HBO stuff on here, but some of this other stuff, some other companies that we have, like it will rotate out to different places, and so it's just an interesting, I guess, idea war going on between the two, and we definitely see where Viacom sits. Viacom CBS is okay, we're keeping our key assets to ourselves, and you can definitely see by this statement, it shows that, okay, in the future that, hey, we're not going to renew these deals that we have with these other players. Like, we're going to get our content back eventually, and it's nice to see Viacom CBS as a whole. Hey, we're going to get into the streaming game. I mean, CBS All Access by itself is a pretty decent experience, but I think it could be more, and it's nice seeing that change of leadership, the change of mindset of, okay, hey, let's actually attack streaming. And they have, I think that they have a pretty viable business plan. So,
all right. So then, Apple TV Plus, Apple will co-produce the spy thriller Tehran, and then jumping straight over to Disney Plus. Disney Plus has decided to end their free trial, and this is ahead of the Hamilton release, which I spoke of earlier. So Hamilton's coming out a week from this Friday on the service, and we actually talked about this when Hamilton was first announced. We were like, well, how do you get around that trial? Because people could literally sign up. Well, one way to get around it is you just eliminate the trial altogether. Disney has said in statements that they believe that the value-based proposition that a customer gets warrants them to get rid of the trial at this point in time, so there's no reason to continue to have a trial. It also makes perfect sense that they time this for the release of Hamilton. Personally, I don't really think a trial is necessary. I think a lot of people, I know that there are people who use and abuse the trial periods when it comes to certain things. They'll subscribe to a service, they'll use it for a short amount of time just to watch a show. There's people with a million emails that they use up, that they use just to sign up for new services every time they want to check something out. I understand that exists, but I think that's such a small percentage of people who actually use the service on a normal basis. I think the majority of people who acknowledge that they want to use Disney Plus for its intended purpose to watch content on a regular basis, I don't think they're the type of people who are, this is harming in any way, because honestly, they're signing up. It's not so much about whether or not they're going to continue to subscribe. If there was actual numbers out there that stated after 7 days of the free trial, how many people actually cancel, I think the number would be so small that it wouldn't make a difference. While we can obviously be completely under the assumption that this is happening because Hamilton's coming out in less than a week and a half, we can also say that without a doubt it's also happening because they don't really need to. Most services, especially when they're new, it's just a way to get people to come in and try it out. But I think that as time progresses, you get to a point where you don't really need to do a trial. Does Netflix really need to do a trial? No, everybody knows what's on Netflix. the trial ends up just being something where people go in and they could potentially abuse it. I don't know very many people who sit there and say, I'm going to sign up for Netflix and I have to pay, maybe, between $7 and $15 a month. And for 1 month, I can't pay $15 to watch a ton of content in a month. Nobody's saying that. So I think that the trials, it's only a matter of time. I think new services will allow trials for a certain amount of time. But honestly, I think that the way of trials is going to be gone in the future because I just don't see a need for them.
I concur. That's my analysis on the thing. I'm actually pretty okay with Disney doing this because from a business point of view, I understand that they need to gain some value from this Hamilton launch. Like, even if people sign up for 1 month and then drop it, like they pay that $6.99 for that fee for basically renting the movie and all the other catalog for that month. Like, that's better than the free trial. And so I understand at some point these streaming services have got to move on past the free trial, and I think Disney Plus is at a point of when you look at the subscriber base and how healthy they are in terms of investors are happy with them, the consumers seem to be happy with them. I mean, they're slowly chugging around content, but they still keep a steady subscriber base somehow. That I think there's a certain point where these streaming companies are going to graduate past the idea of a free trial, or a free trial as we know it might just be like at most a week or something, but not like a whole month of a free trial. And I think that's what we're starting to see. And I'm actually happy for Disney Plus that they're doing this. I know that some consumers are going to be a little bit upset, but the whole point of streaming is that you stay on their platform and you get that residual payment. So you get something like Hamilton, it makes sense why you want to protect that and you want to gain some value out of that. Either it's just 1 month rentals, essentially, as look at it, just 1 month streaming, or you might be able to flip some of those customers to longer term customers to basically make them subscribers. I think that's kind of the beauty of streaming, is that we're seeing very compelling content that's coming out that's going to make people want to sign up for these services. And I have a lot of friends who love Hamilton, and they never were able to actually watch Hamilton live at any type of theater just because Hamilton tickets are really expensive, but usually just because the shows are sold out, and that they're able to experience Hamilton. That's a compelling reason to sign up for the service. And so it's kind of cool to see that we're at the position of, okay, content is actually going to win people over versus just cute marketing ploys. So I think Disney Plus has kind of hit that mark. And I think Netflix is kind of up there too. Amazon Prime is just kind of like a little bit of elite tier. And I don't say elite in a bad way. The other ones are not elite, but like they're just, it seems like Disney Plus has matured past just, okay, like infancy stage to now like a major player. And if you're a major player, there's some things that are afforded to you that you can take risks like these.
All right, so jumping over to Quibi. All right, so Quibi may be looking to get onto more televisions. Maybe you're wondering to yourself, wait, wasn't it just last week that they got onto TVs if you were a Chromecast user? Yes, it is. It's only been a month, actually, since Apple AirPlay and Chromecast. Apple AirPlay was made it so that you could watch your content on a television, and then just last week it was the Chromecast. So now they're talking, there might be word, and this is not confirmed by any way, this is not Quibi stating this, but there might be word that they're looking for options to get onto basically Amazon Fire Sticks, Rokus, things like that. And the idea behind this is that they're looking at it as, well, we have content that is watchable and we want people to watch this content, and we need to figure out a way to get more subscribers, more customers, more viewers in general. And the only way to do that is by making sure that maybe we're not just a mobile only company, which is what they were so stressed on in the very beginning. And this, of course, puts everything that Katzenberg keeps saying into doubt, because it seems like these random things that he says about how they're still sticking with mobile only, you can't flip the TV, it's not designed for the television, the best experience is on mobile only. This obviously is the complete opposite of that, because again, the Chromecast and the AirPlay versions of the app that you use, you watch it in one way. It's not when you're flipping the phone, it changes the view of the screen or anything like that. It is one of those things where it shows that the turnstile option is not as big of a deal as they thought it would be, because they themselves aren't doing anything that makes the turnstile useful when you're watching it on a television, because that was never their intent. So while I understand that their intent was mobile only and they're not going to try to figure out some way of implementing the turnstile on a television, because that would be a lot more than just giving the ability to cast it to the TV, I do think that it puts their entire perspective of what they wanted to achieve in doubt. Well, we're not mobile only, but now we've realized that we can't be just mobile only, so we're going to try to get on other services out there. And I just don't, I see the business side as to why it would make sense to do that, but put into doubt when you start going after those other services.
It's my hesitancy is where to start. I don't think that this is a good idea, and I'm going to come at it from a different way. This is going to be a huge amount of money, which they currently need because they're not getting subscribers. And I think that in the next round of investing, I think they're going to get way less than they think. This is going to be a huge money drop because they're going to have to set up some type of agreements with Roku, Amazon Fire on their platform, Apple TV Plus, into getting on those devices. We've seen the issues that Disney Plus have had. We've seen the issues that HBO Max is currently having with some of those people, and maybe for different reasons. But the point is that those negotiations can be tough, and then they have to give up some amount of money to get their app on that platform. That's just it. They have to do some type of revenue share, and to some extent, and then you have to pay a whole group of developers to support the Roku app, the Fire TV app, Samsung's native app, Apple TV Plus app. Like that's a couple different. It's just extra tax on the engineering team. So that's money poured into that area as well. If they're sticking to the guns of we are mobile content only, why are you, from that perspective, it doesn't make financial sense to pour those money to those different areas and still stick with the guns. We're doing mobile content only first. We're doing the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. We're not touching after that. Our competitors are not Netflix or Disney Plus or HBO Max. It's really other short form content. And from that business plan, from that understanding, it just doesn't make sense that this is a good idea. And I get that they want to show their content on TVs. I know it's been a big push, but if that's the case, if we want our short form content to be viewed on the TV, I don't see how they're going to do that, and that's going to be successful without them actually asking themselves, is our current strategy of just going after short form content actually the best strategy for us to do? And if they're not going to ask that question, then I think that all these engineering endeavors are going to be for naught. Personally, I don't see how else that can happen. I think one interesting thing about this is we pitched back a few, I think last episode of, what if Quibi sells? What was the future of Quibi? Probably that they're going to have to be bought by somebody. If that's the case, I think a really interesting way to set themselves up for a future benefit is maybe some type of integration with the phone, so that you can actually flip the phone, the direction of your phone maybe, and it can tell, and then it will change the viewing live. Like if you look at the Roku app, you can actually control the TV from your phone. It's actually one of the better apps that does that. I know on the Apple TV Plus you can, but it's not the same in terms of integration. I think the Roku app is just a whole lot better in that regard. And it would be cool if there's some way to dynamically change the viewpoint, portrait, landscape, or something with your phone, with a TV stream. I think that there is something there that could potentially be able to be sold off to somebody in terms of potential assets. It's definitely something that could be done. So if they want to set themselves up for an acquisition, I think that maybe investing in that is a smart idea. But otherwise, I think from this perspective of you're pouring money down an avenue that you say that you're not a part of, but you keep doing it, I think that's kind of a waste.
I think the executives in the company are still thinking that the company is salvageable. And like we've said, I just don't think it is. I don't think the company is salvageable. I think that there's technology and aspects that somebody could buy and use, but it ultimately comes down to if they do this, it will be basically a Hail Mary to try to fix the problem, which I just don't think that this is going to fix it. I think it's just going to prolong it.
Agreed. It might actually make it go faster because they're pouring a whole bunch of money down a path that might not gain them anywhere. It might just be a big, huge money suck, and not many people are actually going to use Quibi on the TV. They're making a huge bet that people are saying, yeah, it would be nice if we could use Quibi on the TV. And when they turn that on, how many people are actually using Quibi on their TVs? Is it enough to make it justifiable, or was it just people were complaining, you responded without actually thinking of the underlying premise of what are they actually complaining about? That they can't watch on their TV, or you just have bad content? You might have written them a prescription to solve a different problem that wasn't the underlying problem. And I'm afraid that that's what this is. It's going to be a money drain, and it's going to be they're solving the wrong problem, and they're not taking back. They're not having the humility to maybe admit that they were wrong in some regard of hey, we misjudged the market, and let's own it, and let's change and pivot. But instead, they're just sticking to the guns of what they have, and so this might actually accelerate their downfall, just because of the money that they're going to spend pouring into negotiating deals, paying developers and stuff like that. So it's just Quibi, what are we going to do with you?
Yeah, and we have another one. So Katzenberg is talking again, and this time around he said again that COVID-19 was a cement wall for the service, but he's now treating the slow start as if it was a beta, allowing them a chance to regroup. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of this theory that everything should be blamed on COVID, because quite honestly, it comes across as they made the choice to continue to go forward. While they did not necessarily know that it was going to get as bad as it was or last as long as it did, they made the choice to go forward to launch regardless. Now, you could sit here and swear up and down and say that the company didn't know how serious it was going to be. They didn't know it was going to be a 2.5 month stretch. You could say any of that stuff. The issue, of course, is that when they knew 2 weeks prior to the launch that everything was getting locked down, you can then stop it. You can stop the launch. You have that option. The only thing that it could have potentially costed them is marketing money and the potential issue with some of their advertisers that expected the service to do it right away. That could have been the problem. But the problem is when you look at the larger scheme of how much money they have in it, they talked about how their first ad rate blocks were sold for $175 million, and they sold them all out very quickly. Of course, their company is worth 10 times that amount. So why would they want to risk losing so much more money than what they made off the advertisers by just not, having to figure out ways of adjusting the advertising contracts that were in place? For me, it doesn't make any sense. But anyway, we've talked about that before. But anyway, he claims that, this entire situation is going to allow them to regroup. Personally, I don't think, as we've already said before in just this last news bit that we just said, it's not going to work. It's just prolonging it. And while they've decided to cancel some content that already had aired and said, well, we're not going to do a second season of them, when you look at the content that they have produced, they have spent so much money on content that has produced such little amount of actual view time that it's ridiculous. When you look at the amount of episodes that some of these first seasons have had, and you put in perspective how much time time and money they spent on producing what they produced, it is ridiculous. You've got 8 episodes of some series that are only, every single one of them is less than 10 minutes. It's like making basically an hour and a half long movie, and the production for them, you had to go and spend all that money, and you basically got 8 episodes. It just is mind-boggling that they would have gone that route of not producing way more content to roll out in the future. But instead, we're left with the initial launch content. They've been rolling out maybe one new series every other week for the last couple weeks, and that's it. There's nothing else. It's like, I just don't understand what they were thinking. Like, how, even if people were only watching the stuff on the go, if you take all the daily essentials out and you just look at their top tier programming, you run out of top tier programming after a short amount of time. Like, there's just not enough content there to make it worthwhile. And for me, it just feels like Katzenberg just doesn't get it. He's just continually making excuses about what should have happened instead of what needs to happen.
I mean, I hate to be Mr. Negative here, but okay, let's assume that everything is because of COVID. All right, let's go down this line of reasoning. Everything is messed up because of COVID-19. Does he not know that, Quibi's main launch, its main, target audience is pretty much the United States of America? Does he not know that there's a big resurgence in COVID-19 cases, especially across the South, but in other areas that have been reopened? Like, those comments are not to spur any type of policy debate, but it's just an observation of okay, if you're complaining that COVID-19 is what caused everything, and okay, our beta, that was our beta launch, now we're revamping, does he not know that there's a potential resurgence in COVID-19 cases? Does he not realize that we're still dealing with this pandemic and that things are not going to be normal for a while? Does he not realize that sports as we know them are not happening, that the NBA is still is basically stuck to stay in Disney World, basically in confinement for their mini season? Does he not know that the world is not going back to normal. And so by that argument, it's like, okay, well, things are going back to normal, blah, blah, blah. It's like, that's not true. Like, it just isn't. And there's something more fundamental than just a pandemic. Like, TikTok's still booming. Like, they're doing great. Snapchat's still going strong. Instagram's still got content. YouTube's still going. Like, there's something fundamentally more than than just being the COVID-19. Like, everyone's dealt with COVID-19. Everyone. Like, I understand maybe at the beginning of your launch that there was some issues there, but even HBO Max, like, they've had some launch issues, but they've actually turned out pretty decent for a launch. Like, at some point, the buck stops with you, and you got to own it. And he is not owning it. That's just concerning, because it's like, okay, you can't keep passing the buck, and you got to also understand your circumstances of, like, this is something that's going to happen that will collectively the United States is going to deal with for a while. It just doesn't seem like that's clicking for him. It's just like, okay, well, COVID-19 happened in March, and we're finally getting out of that. It's like, dude, that's not happening. That's concerning that, somebody who's so stuck in their ways, so stuck in this one mode of operation and not being able to pivot. And that's concerning as if I was an investor viewing that's concerning. I want somebody who, yes, they're steadfast. They push forward. They go through hard times, but also needs to be adaptable and realize, okay, like, we also need to pivot. And I appreciate his steadfastness and his unwavering belief in Quibi's current direction. But at some point, you need to sit back and really evaluate and pivot. And even on this Chromecast stuff and AirPlay, like, he wasn't wanting to do that. He wasn't willing to really accept to make that change. And that's sad, because I feel like it was just necessary, and he needed to I'm just losing faith in him. That's all. It's sad, because I thought they really had potential.
All right. So then jumping over to HBO Max, HBO Max has greenlit an adult animated series called 10-Year-Old Tom. They also have landed a psychological thriller, The Ancestor. Sam Dean, who is the creator of Love is Blind over at Netflix, has inked an overall deal with HBO Max. And then Salma Hayek has actually inked a first look deal with HBO Max as well. And then last but not least, Scoob, which was originally meant to be a theatrical release. They moved to a PVOD release instead, and when that came out, it had some success. We don't know how successful, because it hasn't come up in any conversations with any executives, but it was successful enough. They announced a physical release, which is sometime in, I believe, the middle of July, end of July, and then just this past week, they actually announced that Scoob is actually going to be heading to HBO Max a month prior to the physical release. Now, what this basically says is they acknowledge that anybody who is going to buy the film digitally probably already bought it, but there's still people who could potentially be interested in the film prior to the film releasing on disc. So this way they put it on HBO Max, and it gives them another piece of content out there that people would potentially seek out specifically to watch. Now, to put this in comparison, this is very similar to what Disney did with Onward, except Onward was originally in theaters, had a small theatrical run before the shutdown happened, and then after that, they put it on Disney Plus within a month. I think it was less than a month from the time it actually released in theaters. So it was very, very quick. It's not the same thing as Frozen or Star Wars Rise of Skywalker, because both of those projects were just released a little bit earlier than they originally had planned, releasing on the service. But the best comparison is Onward, and Onward Scoob could have done potentially as well as Onward if it was in theaters, because Onward didn't blow box office records or anything like that, but it did well. Scoob could have done well as well. And so it's very comparable in the situation. But it does show that Warner Brothers, if this does anything, it just shows that they're not against the idea of putting content on the service very, very quickly. Now, typically you'd have it come out on physical disc. It ended up on HBO like within three months after the physical release. Then after that, then when it's on HBO, it would be available obviously on HBO Max as well. That obviously could change, because this shows that there's a potential that they could put stuff on before it even heads to physical release, which pushes that idea that streaming is the future, but it also tries to get people to check out the service specifically for these individual projects.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty happy about this, and I don't see why some parties are upset that they're moving some content, just going straight to the streaming service and having it exclusive there for a little bit before he goes to DVD and stuff like that. I understand why people have that complaint, but I'm overall happy about this. You said that you've seen this, and just really quick digression, how was it? How'd you like it?
It was a good film. So I think they did a great job. Given the circumstances, we can see that outside of like really, really high profile animated films that are going to draw a huge crowd, they're just not going to be successful in the theaters going, in the immediate future, just because people are hesitant about going to the theaters. We know that the theaters are going to start to reopen in July for a lot of the different companies and things like that. But the real question is, how many people are actually going to be going to the theaters? How many people are actually going to be okay with seeing a film? I personally want to see, certain films that are coming soon. I don't necessarily have a huge problem, but then again, I don't know how each theater is going to address the social distancing rules and things like that. So I acknowledge that this film could have been really well and set, could have been a huge thing for Warner Brothers as far as setting up additional movies in the future. I think that this is a good route to go, because there's nothing to say that if they keep the budget within a reasonable amount, they couldn't do these movies on HBO Max's exclusives either. So we'll just leave it at that. I'll say it was a good movie, and I would strongly suggest checking it out, even if you are not a hardcore Hanna-Barbera fan. All right, so with that being said, we don't have any other news, so we do have one little topic to discuss. It's not really a little topic, and this could go a lot of different directions, but specifically, there was an article that popped up on Core Cutter News talking about how Google could be interested in buying Roku. While this is not necessarily new news, this is not necessarily nothing that immediately happened over the past week has prompted this. This could have just been an article that they were just rebringing up to just rediscuss this exact same topic. I thought it was an interesting topic because of some things that have been happening recently. So recently, there's been some plans for a new Chromecast device that have leaked that allow a device to be plugged into the actual television, have a remote, have a Google Assistant on the remote, and actually allow you to use an interface rather than just being able to cast things to the television. When Google had Android TV initially, it did not do great. They decided to go the route of using phones as an actual controller rather than including a controller. Obviously, we've seen how that has worked. While people still Chromecast things, it's not a question of whether you can or can't. Most apps allow you to Chromecast, or in the opposite case, AirPlay things to a television. In reality, the devices that have been super successful, Roku, Amazon Fire Sticks, Apple TV, these all have individual remotes that you do not need to have your phone in order to use to control the interface that's on the screen. Chromecast doesn't even have an interface. You're literally only really just mirroring in some ways what's on your screen for a larger screen. So the idea is that this new device will allow you to have an actual interface, allow you to go through different apps that allow you to view content similar to the way Roku is. So the question, of course, is where is the value proposition for Google when it comes to Roku? And we were discussing this a little bit earlier just to set up our conversation. And when it comes to the devices, Google can make devices. We know that they can make devices. And in some cases, they can make devices that are very successful. Not every device that Google makes is very successful, but they have made successful devices. They've purchased companies recently. I shouldn't say recently, but within the last 5 years or so, they've purchased Nest and have acquired them. They've acquired Fitbit. And while Nest has probably the most that has happened amongst them with new devices that have been coming out within the Google smart home ecosystem and things like that, Fitbit that's a newer one because that happened at the end of last year. So we have to wait and see. But these acquisitions that they do, it's more about what is the reasoning behind it. In some cases, when you look at Fitbit, it makes perfect sense for them to acquire them because they previously had smartwatches that they tried to sell themselves. They weren't successful. Now they're just focusing on operating systems, the Wear OS operating systems, while Fitbit has devices that are relatively popular, but they're lacking a real operating system for them to get them to the same level as Apple Watches or Samsung Gears and things like that. So the idea is when we look at Roku, what is the proposition here for Google to really make some money? It's not really the devices. It's not necessarily the interface. While that's all existing and exists, and it's that what we really need to talk about is the customer base. Obviously, we've talked about Roku. 40% of the streaming devices on the market, over 40%, are Roku devices. People are using Roku devices more than any other one, and almost every case, it's more than double of every single one that's out there. So the question is, what does Google get from this when they get an existing customer base that is already higher than Amazon, higher than Apple, higher than the other devices that are out there?
I mean, they'll get data. I mean, that's the first thing. That's the biggest thing, is that you got to remember, what is Google? Google is not just a search engine. Really, the search engine is second. They're an ad business. They place ads for their customers. They place ads, and they need customer data to fuel those ads. And Roku is a perfect place for it. It's because they're a gateway to pretty much all these other services. Like, yeah, it's nice to maybe own a service or two, but if you have access to the door of the gatekeeper that accesses between all these different services, that's a lot of data. That's a lot of rich data. That's a lot of good data, and that they can use and mine and then take over and do other ads with. Another area that I think that there could be some integration is with Google Assistant. Out of the whole smart assistant market, everyone talks about Alexa a lot because Alexa is a pretty nice name, and there's a lot of interesting, cool integrations there. But Google Assistant has a whole lot of integrations, and it works very well. And it's one of the few things that people really like about Google's, push for smart home, is that, Google Assistant's really done very well in terms of popularity and usability. And I can see interesting integrations with Roku and a Google Assistant. And, Google Assistants gain a lot of data as well, and they could use that. But really, this is a data acquisition, but I think it's different than most data acquisitions. You're not just purchasing, you're purchasing a viable company that works. It's sustainable and profitable as it is. It doesn't need somebody to buy them, I think. But from Google's side, it makes a lot of sense. From Roku's side, their biggest competition is Amazon. And Amazon, you have the whole behemoth of Amazon behind their Fire TV business. And so, if Roku wants a little bit of security there, then that makes sense. With Google not owning Android, essentially, exactly, but they have major design choices and influences into the Android operating system, which powers basically most of the phones in the world. Apple's really big in the United States, but really Android phones are really huge outside the United States. Maybe viewing that as a different market as well. I'm curious if there's integrations there between like maybe Roku and Android, from that aspect of maybe Roku is the portal to all these different services that you could watch on Android devices. I don't really know, but that would definitely be interesting as well. Or maybe some weird morph between like Android, this Android TV that's been out there for a little bit, the older version, and there's rumors for a newer version as well. And maybe there's some interesting mesh up there that could happen. So overall, this is great for Roku. Like, hey, they're not a dying company. They can really set the terms of the deal. And there's a good chance that they might be able to operate independently, kind of like Instagram or WhatsApp have been pretty independent from Facebook recently, but really it's just a more integration with ads, and Instagram's ad business is really soared under Facebook, and it has done very well. And being part of that pipeline and being part of the Google pipeline of ad networks is pretty strong and powerful too. So overall, that's my thoughts on this potential rumor for Google buying Roku. I support it, and as long as they leave Roku to kind of do its thing, I'm pretty happy with it. So
it'll be interesting to see what exactly comes of this in the future. If anything, these things could easily just be floated out there to see reactions from the industry as a whole. So we'll see. All right. So with that being said, before we wrap up the episode, I want to let everybody know that there are some trailers that have released over the past week, some more than the last couple weeks, but there's been a bunch, and there's still coming out because there's like an influx of like almost 8 trailers per day at this rate. So with that being said, check out the trailers, check out all the show notes for all the articles that we talked about here on the podcast. You can follow us on Twitter and our Discord to see any of the articles that we talk about on the podcast in the future, as well as articles that we sometimes don't get around to. In addition to that, you can follow us on Instagram for all latest announcements related to new episodes of the podcast. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, please leave feedback. That is always greatly appreciated. We always appreciate if you would send us feedback either through the podcast platform that you're listening to, or you can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, and of course the feedback as well. With all that being said, for Tony and myself, continue to stay safe out there. We'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.